The house stood on the far side of the Manzanares River, just beyond the edge of Madrid, where the cultivated gardens gave way to scrub and the city's noise thinned into the sound of water moving over stones. It was called the Quinta del Sordo, the House of the Deaf Man, though the name had nothing to do with the man who bought it in February of 1819. The previous owner had been deaf. Francisco Goya, 73 years old, recently recovered from another illness, newly remarried in all but law, bought the property because he wanted space and silence and a place to paint that belonged to no one but himself. He had been painting for other people his entire life. He had painted ceilings for churches and walls for palaces. He had painted tapestry cartoons of picnics and kite flyers for the Royal Manufactory. He had painted the king and the queen and their children arranged in silks and metals, their faces catching the light in ways that made them look both regal and faintly ridiculous. He had painted ministers and generals, duchesses and bullfighters, majas clothed and unclothed. He had made prints of witches and demons, of men hanged from trees, of women ravaged by soldiers, of the sleep of reason producing monsters. And now, in this house by the river, he began to paint the walls. He did not prepare sketches. He did not plan a program or consult a patron. He simply began, working directly onto the plaster in oils, covering the walls of the two main rooms on the ground and first floors with images that had no precedent and no clear subject. There were 14 of them in total when he was finished, perhaps in 1823, though the dates are uncertain, and Goya left no record of what he intended or why he made them. They were not meant to be seen. They were not meant to be sold or exhibited. They were paintings made for a deaf man in a house named for deafness, and they are among the darkest and most unsparing images anyone has ever put on a wall. One of them shows an old man with a white beard and wild eyes cramming a human body into his mouth. The body is headless, one arm already gone. Blood darkens the god's hands. The figure is Saturn, the Roman name for Kronos, the Titan who devoured his children to prevent them from overthrowing him. But Goya's version has none of the grandeur or mythological distance you might expect. This is not an allegory. It is a vision of pure compulsion, mindless and terrible, the act of eating rendered as horror. The background is black. There is no context, no story, no redemption, just the god and the body and the act. Another painting shows two men beating each other with clubs, knee-deep in mud or sand, their faces blank with rage. Locked in combat, they cannot escape and cannot win. Another shows a dog's head, just the head and part of the neck, emerging from a vast field of ochre and gray, the animal looking up at something beyond the frame, its expression unreadable, patient or despairing, or simply waiting. Another shows a crowd of faces lit from below, mouths open, eyes wide, staring at something we cannot see, their features dissolving into shadow. Another shows an old woman looking into a mirror held by a younger woman, or perhaps by time itself, and in the mirror the word "Que tal?" How goes it? Written as if the mirror were answering. These paintings were not made for an audience. They were made in solitude, in a house bought for retreat, by a man who had spent his life navigating courts and patrons and the shifting allegiances of Spanish politics, and who had survived all of it: illness, deafness, war, the Inquisition, the collapse and restoration of empires, only to arrive at this, a house by a river and a set of images, so bleak and so interior that they feel like transmissions from some place beyond language. Goya would leave Spain 4 years later in 1824 and never return. The paintings remained on the walls, unseen by anyone but the subsequent owners, until they were transferred to canvas in 1874, half a century after he painted them, and moved to the Prado in 1878. By then he had been dead for 50 years. He never knew they would be seen. He never knew what they would become. But that was the end, or near it. The beginning was different. Francisco José de Goya y Lucentes was born on March 30th, 1746, in the village of Fuendetodos, in the province of Zaragoza, in the Kingdom of Aragon, in the northeast of Spain. Fuendetodos was small and poor, a place of stone houses and hard earth, 60 kilometers from the city of Zaragoza, surrounded by hills that turn gold in summer and gray in winter. His father, José, was a gilder, a craftsman who applied gold leaf to altarpieces and frames, work that required patience and a steady hand but brought in little money. His mother, Gracia Lucentes, came from a family of minor provincial gentry, a step above her husband in social standing, but not in wealth. Francisco was the fourth of 6 children. The family was not destitute, but neither were they comfortable. José's work took him to Zaragoza often, and eventually the family moved there, leaving Fuendetodos behind. Zaragoza in the 1750s was a city of churches and convents, a regional capital with a population of perhaps 50,000, dominated by the Basilica of Our Lady of the Pillar, whose domes and towers rose above the Ebro River. It was a city shaped by the Catholic Church and by the rhythms of religious life feast days and processions, the sounds of bells marking the hours, the presence of monks and priests and nuns moving through the streets. It was also a city with workshops and guilds, where artisans like José Goya could find work gilding the frames and retablos that filled the churches. Francisco grew up in this world, the world of workshops and religious commissions, of gold leaf and plaster, of images made to inspire devotion. He showed an aptitude for drawing early. There are stories, probably apocryphal, of him sketching on walls, on any surface he could find. What is certain is that by the time he was 14, he had been apprenticed to José Luzán, a local painter trained in the late Baroque style, who ran a modest studio in Zaragoza. Luzán taught him the fundamentals, how to prepare a canvas, how to mix pigments, how to copy prints and drawings, how to construct a composition according to the established rules. It was a conventional training, the kind offered in workshops across Europe, based on imitation and repetition. Students copied the works of recognized masters, Italian painters mostly, Raphael and Correggio, and the Carracci, learning to reproduce their forms and gestures before attempting anything original. Goya spent 4 years in Luzán's studio, copying prints, drawing from plaster casts, learning to paint in the manner of the late Baroque, with its emphasis on drama and clarity, and the idealization of the human figure. He was good, but not exceptionally so. Not yet. In 1763, when he was 17, he traveled to Madrid to compete for a scholarship at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts of San Fernando. He did not win. He tried again in 1766. He did not win that time either. The records show that he received not a single vote from the judges. It is unclear what he submitted or why he was rejected so completely, but it suggests that whatever talent he had was not yet visible to the arbiters of official taste. He was 20 years old, without prospects, without a clear path forward. What he did next was leave Spain. In 1770, he went to Italy, though the details of the trip are vague. He may have traveled with a bullfighter. He may have been funded by a patron whose name is lost. He may have simply gone on his own, scraping together enough money to make the journey. Italy was where artists went to complete their education, to see the works of the Renaissance masters firsthand, to absorb the classical tradition at its source. Goya spent time in Rome, possibly in Parma. He entered a competition at the Academy of Parma and won second place and honorable mention for a painting of Hannibal, viewing Italy from the Alps. The judges praised his use of color but criticized his handling of form, saying his figures lacked the nobility expected of historical subjects. It was a minor success, but it was something. More importantly, it was Italy. And Italy meant exposure to the work of Tiepolo, to the grand decorative tradition of the Italian Baroque, to the frescoed ceilings and palatial altarpieces that defined the ambitions of 18th-century painting. He returned to Spain in 1771, still without a clear position, still relying on commissions where he could find them. His first significant work came later that year, painting frescoes for the chapel of the Palace of the Counts of Sobradil in Zaragoza, followed by work on the vault of the choir in the Basilica of Our Lady of the Pillar. The frescoes in the basilica were his first major public commission, a chance to prove himself in his home city. The subject was the Virgin surrounded by angels, rendered in the bright decorative style of the Rococo, with soft colors and flowing drapery and a lightness that suited the taste of the time. It was competent work, accomplished work, but it did not announce a major talent. Not yet. What it did was establish him as a reliable painter, someone capable of handling large-scale religious commissions in the manner expected by the Church. And it brought him into contact with Francisco Goya, one of the leading painters in Spain, who worked for the royal court in Madrid and who had been called to Zaragoza to oversee the decorations of the basilica. Goya was older, more established, and well-connected. He was also the brother of Josefa Goya, whom Goya married on July 25, 1773, in Madrid. The marriage was strategic as much as romantic. Josefa came from a family of artists. Her father had been a painter, her brother Francisco was court painter to King Charles III, and another brother, Ramon, was also a painter. Through the Goya family, Goya gained access to the networks and institutions that governed artistic life in Spain. It was Francisco Goya who helped him secure his first position at the royal court, designing cartoons for the Royal Tapestry Manufactory of Santa Barbara. The Royal Tapestry Manufactory was a state-run workshop that produced tapestries for the palaces of the Spanish crown. The tapestries were woven from designs called cartoons painted by artists employed by the court. The subjects were mostly scenes of everyday life, picnics, dances, games, hunts, depictions of Spanish customs and costumes rendered in a decorative and idealized manner. It was not the kind of work that carried great prestige. The cartoons were functional, made to be translated into thread, not to be exhibited as paintings. But it was steady work, it paid reasonably well, and it placed Goya within the orbit of the court. He began working for the manufactory in 1775, when he was 29. Over the next 17 years, he would produce more than 60 cartoons, paintings on canvas that were then used as templates by the weavers. The early cartoons are light and charming, young women flying kites, men playing cards, children climbing trees, peasants dancing at a festival. They are painted with bright, clear colors and a sense of decorative ease. They show skill but no particular depth. They are pictures meant to please, to decorate the walls of palaces without challenging anyone. But they were also Goya's training in observation. He was painting Spanish life idealized, yes, but rooted in the gestures and costumes and settings he saw around him. He was learning to capture movement, to arrange figures in space, to tell a story within a single image. And he was learning to work within the constraints of patronage, to satisfy the demands of the court while finding room for his own interests. One of the early cartoons, painted in 1777, is called The Parasol. It shows a young woman seated on the ground, shaded by a green parasol held by a young man standing beside her. A small dog sits at her feet. The scene is simple, almost pastoral, painted with soft greens and blues and pinks. The woman is beautiful, the man is attentive, the light is gentle. It is a picture of leisure and grace, designed to appeal to aristocratic sensibilities. But there is something in the way Goya has painted the woman's face, a directness in her gaze, a sense of presence that goes beyond mere decoration. She is not a type. She is a person, painted with attention and care. It was the kind of skill that did not go unnoticed. By 1780, Goya had been elected to the Royal Academy of Fine Arts of San Fernando, the same institution that had rejected him 14 years earlier. His admission piece was a painting of Christ on the cross, a conventional subject rendered in a conventional manner, but it was enough. He was now an academician, a recognized member of the artistic establishment. 3 years later, in 1783, he was appointed deputy director of painting at the Academy. He was moving up. And yet, the work that defined these years, the tapestry cartoons, was work he would later dismiss as merely functional, something he had done because it was required, not because it engaged him deeply. The tension was already there, the need to please patrons, to work within systems of power and taste, while feeling the pull of something else, something darker and more personal. In 1786, Goya was appointed painter to the king, a largely honorary title but one that marked his entry into the upper levels of court patronage. He was 40 years old. He had steady work, a growing reputation, a position at the Academy, and a family, though his marriage to Josefa was marked by loss. They had several children, perhaps as many as 7 or 8, but most died in infancy or early childhood. Only one, Francisco Javier, born in 1784, survived to adulthood. The silence around Josefa and Goya's life is striking. She appears in none of his letters, in none of his portraits. She was there, but barely visible in the historical record, a figure who moved through his life without leaving a clear trace. The late 1780s were years of consolidation. Goya continued to paint tapestry cartoons, including some of his finest, The Meadow of San Isidro, a panoramic view of Madrid filled with hundreds of tiny figures gathered for a festival, painted with remarkable detail and a sense of light that suggests he had been looking closely at Velázquez. He also began to take on more portrait commissions, painting members of the aristocracy and the emerging professional classes. These portraits were different from the tapestry cartoons. They were intimate, direct, attentive to the particularity of the sitter. He painted the Duke and Duchess of Osuna, wealthy patrons of the arts, with a naturalism that suggested he was moving away from the decorative conventions of the Rococo toward something more immediate. In 1789, he was appointed court painter to King Charles IV, who had just ascended to the throne. It was the highest position a painter could hold in Spain, a role that came with a salary, prestige, and the obligation to paint the royal family. Goya was 43. He had arrived. But arrival is a strange word for what happened next. In the winter of 1792 to 1793, Goya fell seriously ill. The nature of the illness is uncertain. Historical sources offer conflicting accounts, and medical records from the period are incomplete. What is known is that the illness was sudden and severe. It left him incapacitated for months, unable to work, possibly unable to move. He suffered headaches, dizziness, partial paralysis, hallucinations. His friend Sebastian Martinez, a wealthy merchant in Cadiz, took him in and cared for him through the worst of it. By the time he recovered, he was permanently and profoundly deaf. The deafness was total. Goya could hear nothing, no voices, no music, no sounds from the street. Communication became laborious, conducted through written notes and gestures. The social world that had sustained his career, the salons and gatherings, the casual exchanges with patrons and friends became difficult to navigate. He withdrew, not entirely but noticeably. The deafness isolated him, and the isolation changed the work. There is a tendency in writing about Goya to treat the illness as a turning point, the moment when he transformed from a court painter of charm and skill into an artist of psychological depth and visionary darkness. It is too simple to say it that way, too neat, but something did change. Not all at once, but gradually, over the years that followed, his work began to turn inward, toward subjects that had nothing to do with the demands of patrons, toward images that seemed to come from some place beyond the rational world. Shortly after his recovery, he painted a series of small cabinet pictures, works on tin, meant for private collections, not public display. The subjects were unsettling, a procession of flagellants, a madhouse, a fire at night, a shipwreck, a bandit attacking a woman. These were not decorative scenes. They were images of violence, chaos, and suffering, rendered with loose, expressive brushwork in a darkness of tone that had not been present in his earlier work. They were experiments, perhaps, ways of working through what the illness had revealed to him. One of the paintings from this period, Yard with Lunatics, shows the courtyard of a madhouse, a stone-walled enclosure where naked or half-naked men fight and gesture and collapse in postures of despair. The light comes from above, harsh and unforgiving. The men are anonymous, their faces hidden or turned away, their bodies twisted by madness or rage or grief. It is a scene without narrative, without redemption. It simply shows, with terrible clarity, what it looks like when reason fails. Goya submitted these paintings to the Academy in January of 1794, along with a letter explaining that they were works he had made to occupy an imagination mortified by the contemplation of my sufferings. The phrase is striking, an imagination mortified. Not inspired, not liberated, but mortified, wounded, made aware of its own limits. He was still court painter. He still had obligations. In 1799 he was promoted to first court painter, the highest rank, a position previously held by Velázquez. He painted the royal family most famously in the monumental group portrait Charles IV of Spain and his family, completed in 1800. The painting shows the king and queen surrounded by their children and relatives, all dressed in elaborate court costumes, standing in a grand interior. Goya has placed himself in the background, visible in shadow, painting the scene, a gesture that echoes Velázquez's Los Meninos. The portrait is extraordinary, not for its grandeur, but for its strangeness. The figures are arranged formally, according to the conventions of royal portraiture, but there is something off about them. The faces are not idealized. They are rendered with almost clinical precision, the king's blank expression, the queen's hard gaze, the children's awkwardness. Charles IV looks amiable but dim, his face soft and untroubled. Queen Maria Luisa looks shrewd and imperious, her mouth set in a line that suggests she was the one who actually held power. The overall effect is unsettling. It is a state portrait that somehow reads as satire, though whether Goya intended it that way is impossible to say. The king apparently loved it. This is the central tension of Goya's career. He was the court painter, but he painted the court with an honesty that verged on mockery. He was dependent on royal patronage, but his vision was too clear, too unsparing to flatter in the conventional sense. He survived by being indispensable, by being so skilled that the awkwardness of his portraits could be overlooked or misread as a kind of naturalism, but alongside the official work, he was making something else. In 1797 and 1798, Goya produced a series of 80 aquatint prints called Los Caprichos, the Caprices. They were published in February of 1799 and offered for sale in a shop on the Calle del Desengaño, the Street of Disillusionment. The prints were unlike anything else being made in Spain at the time. They were satirical, fantastical, and deeply critical of Spanish society. They depicted priests and monks as ignorant and corrupt, aristocrats as vain and foolish, women as seductive and dangerous, men as lustful and stupid. They showed witches and demons, donkeys dressed as doctors, monsters emerging from the darkness. The accompanying captions were cryptic and biting. They say yes and give their hand to the first comer. What a tailor can do! The sleep of reason produces monsters. That last image, number 43 in the series, shows a man slumped over a table, asleep, while around him owls and bats swarm out of the darkness. It is often read as an Enlightenment allegory. Reason sleeps, and monsters emerge, but it is more ambiguous than that. The man is asleep, yes, but the creatures are his dreams, and dreams come from within. The image suggests that reason and unreason are not opposites, but companions, that the monsters are always there, waiting for the light to dim. The Caprichos were not well received. They were too strange, too critical, too dangerous in a country where the Inquisition was still active. Goya withdrew them from sale after only a few weeks. In 1803, he donated the copper plates to the Royal Printing Office, possibly to protect himself from scrutiny. He had come too close to saying what could not be said. At the same time, he was painting portraits of astonishing intimacy and psychological depth. He painted the Duchess of Alba, with whom he may or may not have had an affair. The evidence is circumstantial, the stories are many, the truth is unknowable. What remains is the portraits, the Duchess dressed in black, pointing to the ground where Goya's name is written in the sand, the Duchess in white, standing against a landscape, gazing directly out of the frame with an expression that is both inviting and remote. He painted her with a directness that suggests familiarity, even obsession. He painted La Magia Desnuda, a reclining female nude, followed by an almost identical painting, La Magia Vestida, with the same figure now closed. The nude was scandalous, not because it showed a naked woman, but because it was not mythological. She was not Venus or Diana. She was a woman, painted with pubic hair visible, an almost defiant realism. The paintings were kept private, hidden in the collection of Manuel Godoy, the Prime Minister and the Queen's favorite, and Goya was later called before the Inquisition to explain them. He survived the inquiry, but the paintings remained controversial, a reminder that even the court painter could be dangerous. By the early 1800s, Goya was in his mid-50s, deaf, increasingly isolated, and working in two registers at once, the official portraits and commissions that sustain his position, and the private works, the prints, the cabinet pictures, the experiments that revealed something much darker. And then, in 1808, Spain collapsed. Napoleon's armies invaded the Iberian Peninsula. King Charles IV abdicated. His son Ferdinand VII briefly took the throne, then was forced to abdicate as well. Napoleon installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte as King of Spain. The Spanish people rose up in rebellion. The Peninsular War began, a conflict that would last 6 years and leave Spain devastated. Goya stayed in Madrid. He was in his 60s, deaf, with a family to support and a position to maintain. He painted Joseph Bonaparte's portrait an act of pragmatism, not loyalty. He accepted a royal order from the occupying regime, the Royal Order of Spain, a decoration given by the French. He also began documenting what the war looked like. The result was The Disasters of War, a series of 82 prints made between 1810 and 1820, though not published until 1863, 35 years after his death. They are among the most harrowing images of violence ever made. They show bodies hanging from trees, women raped by soldiers, men castrated and mutilated, corpses piled in the streets, civilians starved and begging. They show the war not as a series of battles, but as a landscape of atrocity. There are no heroes, no glory, no redemptive narrative. Just bodies and suffering and the collapse of any pretense of civilization. One print shows a man tied to a post, about to be executed by a firing squad. The caption reads, "Por qué? Why?" Another shows a pile of naked corpses, limbs tangled, faces turned away. The caption, "This is what you were born for." Another shows a man being torn apart, pulled in opposite directions. The caption, "One cannot look at this." Goya made them anyway. He also painted the 2nd of May, 1808, and the 3rd of May, 1808, two large canvases that depict the Madrid uprising and its aftermath. The second painting is the more famous. It shows Spanish civilians being executed by French soldiers at night in a clearing outside the city. The condemned stand in a line, some already fallen, others waiting their turn. In the center, a man in a white shirt throws his arms wide, his palms open, about to be shot. His face is twisted in terror or defiance. The soldiers are faceless, their backs to the viewer, rifles raised. A lantern on the ground casts harsh light across the scene. The background is dark, almost black. The painting is not about heroism. The man in the white shirt is not a hero. He is terrified. The composition is not triumphant. It is brutal and immediate and unbearably sad. Goya painted it in 1814, after the war was over, after Ferdinand VII had been restored to the throne, after the bodies had been buried. He painted it as a record, as witness, as an attempt to hold on to what had happened before it could be turned into myth. The war ended in 1814. Napoleon was defeated. Ferdinand returned to Spain and immediately set about dismantling the liberal reforms that had emerged during the conflict. He restored the Inquisition, censored the press, and imprisoned or exiled anyone suspected of liberal sympathies. Spain, which had briefly glimpsed the possibility of a constitutional government, returned to absolutism. Goya had painted both sides. He had painted Joseph Bonaparte. He had painted the atrocities committed by French soldiers. He had also painted the atrocities committed by Spanish guerrillas. He had accepted honors from the occupying regime and from the restored monarchy. He had survived by being useful and hard to pin down, but survival came at a cost. He was not arrested, but he was watched. His position protected him, but only barely. He was 68 years old. He had lived through the collapse and restoration of empires. He had seen things that could not be unseen. And he kept working. In 1815, he painted a series of bullfighting scenes, moments of violence and spectacle rendered with loose, expressive brushwork. He had loved bullfighting since he was young, but these paintings were not celebrations. They were studies in motion and danger, the moment before impact, the moment when the bull and the man meet. In 1816 and 1817, he made another series of prints, the Tauromaquia, documenting the history and practice of bullfighting in Spain. They were less personal than the disasters, more ethnographic, but they carried the same attention to violence, the same refusal to look away. In 1819, he bought the Quinta del Sordo. The house was not large, but it had space. 2 floors, each with 2 main rooms, and a garden that sloped down to the river. The views were open, the air was clearer than in the crowded streets of Madrid, and it was far enough from the city to feel like a retreat. Goya had recently taken up with Leocadia Weiss, a younger woman, possibly the mother of Rosario Weiss, a girl Goya would later teach to draw. Leocadia had left her husband and moved into the house with Goya. The arrangement was never formalized, but it was understood. They were together. And then, sometime between 1819 and 1823, Goya painted the walls. He started on the ground floor, in the 2 main rooms. One room faced south, the other east. He covered the walls with large figures, almost life-sized in some cases, painted directly onto the plaster with oils. The subjects were strange, a procession of people, a gathering of men listening to a reader, 2 old people eating soup, a pair of old men, possibly Goya and Father Time, staring at each other. The tones were dark blacks, browns, deep reds, ochres with almost no bright colors, no blues or greens, nothing to relieve the oppressive atmosphere. On the first floor, the paintings became even darker. One wall showed Judith and Holofernes, the biblical story of a woman who seduces and beheads an enemy general. Goya's version is not heroic. Judith stands over the body, knife in hand, her face blank. Another wall showed 2 women and a man, possibly the Fates, one of them holding a mirror. Another showed the dog, just the dog's head rising out of nothingness looking up. Another showed Saturn. Saturn devouring his son is the most famous, but it was not the only image of violence on the walls. There was also fight with cudgels, 2 men beating each other, sinking into the earth as they fight. There was the procession, which some have read as a pilgrimage, others as a scene of madness or death. There was Asmodea, a floating figure pointing toward a distant horizon, possibly a demon, possibly a vision of revelation, the meaning uncertain. The paintings were not finished in a conventional sense. There are passages of loose, almost gestural brushwork, areas where the plaster shows through, faces that dissolve into shadow. They were not made to be seen from a distance, or to be reproduced in prints. They were made for this house, for these walls, for Goya himself. It is easy to read them as the work of a man at the edge of despair. Goya was 73 when he started, 77 or 78 when he finished. He was deaf, isolated, living in a country that had torn itself apart and put itself back together in a way that satisfied no one. He had survived the war, the occupation, the Inquisition, the Restoration, multiple illnesses, the deaths of most of his children. The black paintings can seem like the logical endpoint of all that survival, the moment when the darkness he had been documenting his entire life finally consumed him. But that reading is too simple. The paintings are dark, yes, but they are also strange, and the strangeness resists easy interpretation. The dog is not a symbol of despair. It is a dog, looking up, waiting. The old people eating soup are not monsters. They are old people, eating. The violence is present, Saturn, the cudgels, but so is something else, attention, patience, a willingness to look at what is there, without flinching and without explaining it away. Goya lived in the house until 1824. In March of that year, Ferdinand VII, who had been ruling with increasing brutality, faced a liberal uprising. The uprising was crushed with the help of French troops, and Ferdinand's repression intensified. Goya, who had been too visible, too connected to liberal circles, too difficult to categorize, decided it was time to leave. In June, he signed the house over to his grandson, Mariano, and left Spain for France. He went to Bordeaux, a city in the southwest of France, near the Spanish border, where a community of Spanish exiles had settled. He was 78 years old. He would never return to Spain. In Bordeaux, he lived quietly, renting rooms, drawing a pension from the Spanish crown, painting when he could. He was old, his health was failing, but he kept working. He made a series of miniatures on ivory, tiny paintings rendered with extraordinary delicacy, bullfighters, monks, Majas, scenes of everyday life, all painted on surfaces no larger than a few inches across. They were private works, made for himself or for friends, experiments in technique and observation. He also painted portraits. One of the last, from 1827, is a portrait of José Pío de Molina, a friend and fellow exile. The painting is remarkable for its immediacy. The man is shown against a dark background, his face turned slightly, his expression calm and direct. The brushwork is loose but precise, capturing the weight of the face, the texture of the skin, the presence of a person who is there, in the room, looking back. In 1828, Goya suffered a series of strokes. He was confined to bed, unable to move. His daughter-in-law and grandson came from Madrid to see him. He tried to draw, holding the pencil with difficulty, making a few marks on paper. On April 16, 1828, he died. He was 82 years old. He was buried in Bordeaux, in the cemetery of the Chartreuse, next to his friend and fellow painter, Martin Miguel de Goicoechea. In 1888, 60 years after his death, his remains were exhumed and returned to Spain, reburied in Madrid in the church of San Antonio de la Florida, which he had decorated with frescoes in 1798. The frescoes show Saint Anthony of Padua raising a murdered man from the dead, surrounded by a crowd of onlookers madrileños, ordinary people, painted with the same attention Goya brought to all his subjects. But when the coffin was opened in Bordeaux, they found that the skull was missing. No one knows what happened to it. There are theories that it was taken by a phrenologist, that it was lost, that it was never there to begin with, but no answers. Goya's body was returned to Spain, but his head was lost. The black paintings remained on the walls of the Quinta del Sordo until 1874, when a French banker named Frédéric Emile d'Erlonga bought the house and decided to preserve the paintings. The process of transferring them from plaster to canvas was delicate and destructive. The paintings were cut from the walls, mounted on fabric supports, and restored, a process that almost certainly changed them, altering the colors, the tones, the surfaces. What we see now in the Prado is not exactly what Goya painted. It is a version, a translation, mediated by time and the violence of preservation. They were exhibited publicly for the first time in 1878 at the Universal Exposition in Paris, and then donated to the Prado, where they have been ever since, hung together in a room devoted to Goya's late work. When they were first shown, critics and viewers were baffled. These were not the works of a court painter. They were too raw, too disturbing, too modern. They seemed to belong to a different century. In some ways, they did. The black paintings prefigure the work of later artists Edvard Munch's The Scream, James Ensor's Masked Crowds, Francis Bacon's deformed figures, the Expressionists and Surrealists, who would turn inward to explore the irrational and the unconscious. Goya painted them more than a century before Freud published The Interpretation of Dreams, but they feel like images from the unconscious, like dreams that have been made visible. But they are also deeply rooted in Goya's own time. They are responses to the world he lived in, a world of war and terror, of political violence, and the collapse of certainties, of reason failing and the old structures crumbling. They are not universal symbols. They are particular visions made by a man who had seen too much and who painted what he saw without explanation. After his death, Goya's reputation went through phases. In Spain, he was remembered as a court painter, a skilled portraitist, and the creator of some disturbing prints. The black paintings were mostly ignored, too strange to fit into the narrative of Spanish art. Outside Spain, he was known but not widely celebrated. The Romantic writers admired him. Baudelaire called him a painter of modern life, but he was not as famous as Velázquez or El Greco. It was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that Goya's full achievement began to be understood. The Impressionists admired his loose brushwork, his attention to light. The Symbolists and Surrealists saw in his prints and late works a vision of the irrational that aligned with their own interests. Picasso studied him closely, especially during the Spanish Civil War, when he was painting Guernica. The figure of the woman holding the dead child in Guernica echoes Goya's disasters of war. The chaos and violence of the composition, the refusal to glorify or sentimentalize, the sense of bearing witness, all of it, comes from Goya. Guernica was painted in 1937, a little more than a century after Goya's death, in response to the bombing of a Basque town by Nazi and fascist forces during the Spanish Civil War. Picasso had been living in Paris, removed from the immediate violence, but when he heard about the bombing, he began work on the painting. It was finished in about a month, a massive canvas showing the destruction of the town, the suffering of its people, rendered in fractured forms and harsh blacks and whites. It is the most famous anti-war painting of the 20th century, and it is explicitly in conversation with Goya's The 3rd of May 1808. Picasso understood what Goya had done, turned painting toward witness, toward documentation of atrocity, toward a refusal to look away. He also understood that such images do not redeem the violence they depict. They do not offer hope or resolution. They simply insist that the violence be seen, that it be remembered, that it not be turned into myth or abstraction. This is what Goya left behind, a way of looking at the world that is clear-eyed and unsparing, that refuses to console or flatter, that sees beauty and horror as inseparable. He was not the first artist to depict violence. Violence has been a subject of art since the beginning, but he was the first to depict it without the mediating structures of religion or mythology, without the distancing effects of allegory or heroism. In his late work, violence is just violence, madness is just madness, the irrational is always there, beneath the surface, waiting. The question that haunts Goya's work is this: what do you do with such vision? How do you live in a world where reason produces monsters, where the court painter paints the court as fools, where the war is documented in images of unspeakable cruelty. Goya did not answer the question. He painted it. He lived it. He survived it, barely, and then he left, and the paintings remained. The black paintings, which were never meant to be seen, have become some of the most famous images in Western art. They are reproduced in textbooks, discussed in essays, analyzed for their symbolism and their psychology. They are read as allegories of despair, as images of the unconscious, as prefigurations of modernism. All of these readings are plausible, but none of them fully capture what it is like to stand in front of them, to see them at full scale, to feel the weight of the darkness and the strangeness. The dog, in particular, resists interpretation. It is just a dog's head, rising from an indeterminate space, looking up. The background is ochre and gray, featureless, almost abstract. The dog's expression is impossible to read. It is waiting, or it is lost, or it is patient, or it is alone. It is one of the simplest images Goya ever made, and one of the most haunting. Some have read it as an image of Hope the dog looking toward something beyond the frame, something we cannot see. Others have read it as an image of futility, the dog trapped, sinking, about to disappear. Both readings are possible. Both are incomplete. The painting does not resolve. It simply shows, and the act of showing is enough. This is what Goya understood, perhaps better than any artist before him, that not all images need to be explained, that some things can only be shown, that the act of looking is itself a kind of knowledge. He was a court painter who painted the court without illusions. He was a man who survived the Inquisition, the war, the Restoration, and the collapse of everything he had known, and he painted what he saw. He was deaf, isolated, and increasingly alone, and he covered the walls of his house with images that no one was supposed to see. And then he left, and the images remained, and they became part of the history of painting, part of the vocabulary of how we understand violence and madness and the irrational. They did not redeem anything. They did not make the world better. But they insisted, and they continue to insist, that what was seen be remembered, that what was painted be preserved, that the darkness not be turned away from. In the last years of his life, in Bordeaux, Goya was still drawing. There is a drawing from 1826 or 1827, made when he was 80, that shows an old man with a long beard, walking with two canes, bent almost double. The inscription at the bottom reads, "Aún aprendo." I am still learning. It is a small drawing, a few quick lines, but it captures something essential about Goya. He was always learning, always looking, always willing to see what was in front of him, no matter how difficult. He did not turn away, he did not sentimentalize, he did not offer false hope. He simply looked, and he painted what he saw, and the paintings have outlasted everything, the court he served, the wars he documented, the house he left behind. The black paintings are in the Prado now, in a room on the ground floor, hung close together, Saturn and the dog and the old people and the crowd. The room is quiet, usually, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing. People walk through slowly, or they stand for a long time in front of one painting, trying to understand. But understanding is not the point. The point is to see, to be present with the images, to let them work on you the way they worked on Goya, slowly, over time, without explanation. Outside the museum, Madrid goes on, loud and crowded, full of light and noise. Inside, in the room with the black paintings, it is dark, and the figures on the walls are waiting, and the dog looks up, and Saturn eats, and the men fight, and none of it resolves. Goya made them for himself, in a house by a river, and he left them there, and now they are here, and we are here, and the act of looking continues. This is what a life in art looks like, sometimes. Decades of skill and compromise, of working for patrons and courts and systems you do not believe in, of learning to see clearly and then painting that clarity even when no one is watching. Goya was not a saint. He was not a rebel. He was a painter who survived by being useful, by being indispensable, by being too skilled to ignore. But he was also a painter who refused to lie, who painted the world as he saw it, with all its beauty and all its horror, and who left behind images that insist on being seen. He was 82 when he died, far from home, in a country that was not his own, in a city where almost no one knew who he was. He had been a court painter, an academician, a maker of tapestry cartoons and royal portraits. He had also been the maker of the capricos and the disasters of war and the black paintings, works that no one asked for and no one wanted, works that were too dark and too strange to fit into the narratives of progress or taste or the triumph of reason. He made them anyway, and they survived him, and they outlasted the kings and the wars and the systems that had given his life its shape. There is a late portrait painted by Vicente Lopez in 1826 that shows Goya in Bordeaux, 2 years before his death. He is sitting, dressed in black, his hands resting in his lap. His face is old, deeply lined, the eyes tired but still sharp. He looks directly at the viewer, without expression, without softness. It is a face that has seen everything, a face that no longer needs to explain. This is how he looked at the end, old, deaf, far from home, still working, still learning, still refusing to turn away. He had painted kings and majas and witches and saints. He had painted picnics and bullfights and executions and madness. He had painted Saturn eating his children and a dog looking up, and 2 men beating each other in the mud. He had painted the world as it was, and as it might be, and as it should not be, but is, and now the work is all that remains. The kings are gone, the wars are over, the house by the river is gone, torn down and rebuilt and changed beyond recognition. The skull is missing, but the paintings are still here, in the Prado and in museums around the world, and they are still doing what they have always done, insisting that you look, insisting that you see, insisting that the darkness and the light and the strangeness of being human not be explained away or turned into something simpler than it is. Goya painted for 80 years. He painted through deafness and war and political terror. He painted through the deaths of his children and the collapse of empires. He painted for kings and for himself and for no one. And what he left behind is a body of work that is as clear-eyed and unsparing as anything in the history of art, a body of work that insists, quietly and persistently, that we look at what is there, that we see what is true, that we not turn away. In the end, that is the legacy, not the honors or the titles or the position at court, not the tapestries or the royal portraits or the charming scenes of everyday life. The legacy is the refusal to lie, the willingness to see, the images that should not exist but do. Saturn and the dog, and the firing squad, and the madhouse, and the 2 men in the mud. The monsters that reason produces, and the light that still shines through, and the act of painting itself, which is the act of paying attention, of being present, of bearing witness. Goya was a court painter who painted the court without illusions. He was a survivor who documented what survival costs. He was a deaf man who painted silence and noise in the space between them. He was an old man who covered the walls of his house with images no one would see for 50 years. And he was an artist who understood, better than almost anyone, that not all images need to be explained, that some things can only be shown, that the act of looking is enough. The paintings are still here. The dog is still looking up. Saturn is still eating. The men are still fighting. The darkness is still dark. And we are still here, looking, learning, trying to see what Goya saw, trying to understand what he knew, that the world is beautiful and terrible, that reason and unreason are inseparable, that the monsters are always there, and that painting, at its best, is not about resolution or redemption, but about the act of seeing clearly, without flinching, without turning away. Goya painted that act. He lived it, and the work remains, patient and unsparing, waiting for us to look.